Man, that track needs more work. Welcome back. I'm not gonna waste your time if you're watching this in the future, but yeah, I'm just gonna continue making these Megaman levels in Blender. I should be done the first one by the end of this stream, but we'll see what happens. Other than that, I'm just gonna shut up, zone out, listen to these SCP stories by the Exploring series, and yeah, just sit back, relax, enjoy. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. But I also have the screencast keys on, so you should, that little red icon in the bottom left, you should be able to figure out what I'm doing. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Otherwise, let's just get started.
P001 0513 SCP-001 A Good Boy. In any organization, even one as competent and regimented as the SCP Foundation, problems most typically arise due to human error. People make mistakes, or forget things, or become complacent, or any number of other things that can result in things going wrong. This is the way things have been for thousands of years, and despite this issue, humans have continued marching ahead. In the case of the SCP Foundation, though, mistakes cost lives, often many of them, and in some cases potentially all of them. The article we'll be looking at today, one of the SCP-001 proposals, describes a scenario in which the Foundation decides to entrust the creation of containment procedures to an artificial intelligence, rather than humans. Let's see how that goes. SCP-001 is, in this case, an ersatz-type AK-9 computational engine, built in 1955 by the Foundation for the purpose of providing predictive analysis regarding the potential locations and properties of undiscovered anomalies. It accomplishes this through a complicated machine learning process based on known anomalies that's clearly ahead of its time, and which was partly developed by several ex-employees of Prometheus Labs. In 1959, it was hypothesized that the same system could also be used to assist in creating containment procedures for Euclid and Keter-class anomalies based on other contained SCPs. As it turned out, the revised containment protocols created by the AI were quite successful, consistently reducing the rate of containment breaches, and in many cases resulted in the complete cessation of anomalous behavior. The curious thing is, however, that the containment procedures would often affect other unrelated anomalies, perhaps due to some phenomenon similar to the butterfly effect. What follows is a series of containment protocols created by the AI, with a vote by the O5 Council on whether or not it should be implemented. To start, we have SCP-1773, a safe class anomaly consisting of a species of tardigrade that cannibalize one another until only a number of large specimens remain, resembling small pieces of candy. The species is poisonous to humans despite its appearance, and they can survive digestion, chewing on the subject's stomach lining as they pass through. The AI proposed that, in addition to their normal containment protocol, 10 grams of dust would be added to the tardigrade's container every 2 weeks. The majority of the O5 Council approved this, presumably thinking it rather inane, and while it didn't result in any change to SCP-1773, it did seem to affect SCP-1384, a humanoid entity located in a marble tunnel in Scotland. This entity adheres to a system of unknown rules that force it to move in certain directions in this tunnel, steps at a time. Its goal seems to be reaching the far end of the hallway, which the Foundation doesn't want to let happen. The change in 1773's containment protocol resulted in the 1384 entity taking 3 steps backwards. So, those are 2 completely unrelated entities, and it seems pretty strange that such an insignificant change in one's containment protocols would affect the other at all. This could just be a coincidence, so let's keep reading. Next, we have an SCP that I've covered previously, SCP-3034, a reoccurring radio broadcast of unknown origin that is picked up only within 2 kilometers of a specific Russian counting station. The broadcast consists of a young girl counting down in Russian from 200, which is only ceased by speaking into a microphone at the counting station and saying that all is well. The change in containment protocols proposed by the AI was that no children should be allowed at the counting station under any circumstance. In some ways, this is a pretty strange thing to include in containment protocols, as I can't imagine too many children are allowed at any Foundation-controlled facility, but it also makes some sense for SCP-3034 specifically. When a Foundation researcher at the site conducted an unauthorized test and tried to speak to the Russian girl, it resulted in a significant increase in missing children cases across the world, and the audio distortion in the background of the broadcast seems to consist of thousands of screaming children. Clearly, children are connected to that SCP in some bad way, so it's not as ridiculous as the first proposal was. Things get even more interesting with the AI's next proposal, in which it spontaneously announced that Foundation Site 13 is to appear someplace else on planet, encompassing white male counterparts that drawn to empty flagstones and the gun noises in their own blood. At the time, the SCP Foundation had no Site 13, so the proposal was ignored as a useless jumble of text. 5 days later, however, SCP-1730 manifested, the Site 13 from another reality. How exactly the AI managed to predict such an event is unknown. The next proposal was for SCP-2170, a number of non-physical entities within an abandoned mine in Nevada that interacted with individuals through whispering voices and
it's
fleeting
good.
images.
Dinking or ducking.
The entities are
I don't know what to
non-malicious,
call you.
but interaction
Thanks.
with them is detrimental to long-term
What's good, man?
physical
What you been up to?
and mental health,
Let's turn
due
this
to
guy down
causing
a bit.
hallucinations, paranoia, increased hostility, seizures, and harming oneself. What the AI proposed to help contain these entities was rather strange, but it suggested that only individuals
Here, I'll
with a
show
strong
you,
affinity and affection
The other ones I did.
clowns
So the other
be
day I
involved
did this
in containment
fireman
for
one.
SCP-2170.
So
The proposal was narrowly approved by the O5 Council, as I'm sure many of them have.
and if I
reason to
render
be
it,
skeptical.
then yeah, it's
But again, it seemed to work.
I don't know. I basically just
Despite
take.
the 2170 entities
Let me just turn
having
this
no
guy off
other
for a sec.
connection to
I basically just take this image on the left here, and then I don't even know how to explain it, man. It's like this geometry is made up of a few faces, right? So if I select this face specifically, you can see it's highlighted here on this part of the image. So if I were to move these coordinates, then that face of that image changes. So essentially all I did was I took the, I have them side by side, so yeah, I lay out a shape, I just add in those little coordinates, and then yeah, it becomes 3D. So if I look at this little thing, I don't know what that is, a little sphere eyeball thing, but I decided to recreate it in 3D, and yeah, I mean, I don't know how to properly explain this, but moving on, I'll show you the other ones I did. So again, same idea. I took a shape. I took the geometry of it, and then I just mapped it over top of the the image. So it's I don't know. It's a neat little trick to recreate these scenes in 3D. It's just 3D geometry with the with just mapping it, right, or masking, whatever you call it. So the other one I did was Elecman or Electric Man. In my opinion, it doesn't look too good. It's kind of hacked together, and it's honestly a little bit bland, but yeah, I mean, not bad. I mean, it just doesn't look as good as I thought it would. But by far my favorite has to be this Cutman one. I think it's just because it has a little bit more going on in the stage. So if I render it, so you can see it has some depth here, Actually, a better way to show this off would be to... Just give me 1 second here. Let me just put it in this mode. So yeah, essentially I learned how to take my PS4 controller, map it to my computer, and I can basically move the camera around in Blender now, as if it was like, like a video game. So kind of cool. Let me just turn off those that background grid. So yeah, like I don't know, a neat little trick I learned. So it's nice to see these levels in like 2.5D, I guess you'd call it. And I guess later on when I want to like record footage and actually make a video, I could do like pretty interesting camera tricks, like panning and like speeding up and slowing down. But yeah, it's pretty much the plan. Just go through all these games and basically just recreate them in 3D. So gonna get back to it. If you have any questions or comments, or you want to just chit chat, I'm all good with that. But the plan is just to literally just zone out and work away at this. So I'm gonna continue doing that. Let's continue.
Clowns, and in fact evidence shows them expressing distaste for clown iconography. Individuals with recent happy thoughts related to clowns are not affected by the negative effects of the entities. What we have here is clearly more than a machine drawing upon a volume of data and making conclusions based on understandable logic. At this point, we can see that a number of the O5s are hesitant about putting too much faith in the AI's seemingly random proposals, but the rest of the council are on board with whatever it has to say. A big shift comes with the next proposal, again spontaneously produced by the AI with no input from the Foundation. It declared that it saw soldiers built with aluminum innards extruding from their mouths effectively destroyed by humans at Site 95. The council wasn't exactly sure what this entailed, but decided to double the number of active security at Site 95 and place all the on-site MTF squads on standby. Sure enough, 3 days later, Site 95 was attacked by a group of Chaos Insurgency agents leading a platoon of augmented soldiers. The additional security forces at the site proved instrumental in repelling the attack. This leads to the council taking a vote on establishing an early warning system across multiple sites based on the AI's ability to predict threats and containment breaches. The council was clearly very divided on this issue, as it puts a lot of faith in a machine, but the proposal was narrowly approved. 3 months later, the system is integrated into numerous sites, with humans interpreting the AI's outputs to determine any imminent threats. The AI was not done with handling containment protocols, though, and next it suggested that containment procedures should always include precise measurements for their cells. It specifically mentions the measurement 5 by 5 by 5. The council votes to test several high-risk anomalies by changing their containment procedures to include specific cell measurements. 3 months later, they found that this resulted in a significant decrease in the severity of all associated anomalies and the number of containment breaches initiated by them. This was most evident with anomalies whose cell dimensions contain numbers divisible by 5. Next, we have an early warning from the AI regarding Site 114, informing them that all chambers underground should be flooded with water over and over and over to contain the avian's apes' ovulation and make them good boys. 5 hours later, an instance of SCP-3199 breached containment, a dangerous entity that, given space, will rapidly regurgitate eggs containing more of their species, easily leading to a catastrophic scenario in case of a breach. While it seems like a haphazardous time to try a wildly different containment method, the personnel of Site-114 flooded the lower chambers with water, leading to the 3199 instance entering an inert state. The process is now a standard procedure in case of 3199 containment breaches. Next, we have a series of proposals related to SCP-2717, a complex of living animal tissues located beneath a pumping station in Amsterdam. The complex consists of roughly 4 kilometers of sewer pipes, weighing an estimated 350 metric tons. It is also
What's up,
consistently
Kyle?
and steadily growing
Kyle
and
Krypton,
developing
eh?
different types of
What's
tissues,
good, man? What you been up to?
including primitive bone structures, neural fibers.
I'm basically just,
receptor cells.
I don't know, if you have questions, like, you know, I'm down to talk and everything, but yeah, basically the plan is just zone out, listen to these SCP things, and just work away at this little project. So, yeah, I really don't have anything else to say. I'm just going to turn up the volume again. But feel free to talk. If you got questions, you know, if you want to talk, like, I'm down, but yeah, I don't know how else to explain it.
And decides to reject the proposal. As I suppose that despite their typical reputation, they're not willing to throw away human lives without some logic behind it. 2 months after rejecting the proposal, though, 2717 undergoes something referred to as an ovulation event, resulting in a catastrophic breach of containment and loss of human life. The AI comes back again and proposes that now they need at least 4 D-Class to die down there, rather than just 2. Many on the council are spooked now, and overall they vote to approve this proposal, but they are in fact overruled by the Ethics Committee, who don't seem as alarmed by any correlations. Sure enough, a month later, 2717 undergoes another ovulation event. The AI is committed though, and proposes that now they need 6 D-Class every few months to stay underground inside of the entity until they are indistinguishable from their surroundings. It says there should be no more testing, and that good boys are not permitted to leave. Good boys stay. Whatever exactly happened behind the scenes, the proposal finally goes through as the council worked with the Ethics Committee to make it happen. Since then, there have been no more ovulation events. Both the Ethics Committee and the O5 Council have come around now to accepting the AI's often ridiculous proposals simply because they are effective, and that's all that really matters. Sometime later, an early warning alert pops up at Site 95, consisting of a mathematical formula. The manifestation of this formula caused 2 things to occur, both related to bears. First, it caused all bears associated with SCP-2875 to dematerialize. 2875 is a phenomenon in a town in Wisconsin, where every 3 days at noon, between 50 to 100 fully grown grizzly bears suddenly appear. The bears themselves act like normal members of their species, but if left unchecked, the population of bears will quickly grow out of control. Killing one of these bears with a firearm results in 2 more bears immediately manifesting, so the Foundation is forced to spread a aerosolized tranquilizer across the bears before dispatching them with blunt weapons to the skull. The second effect of the formula was nullifying the anomalous properties of SCP-1313, a mathematical equation which, when resolved, produced a live bear as the answer. What the AI did then essentially was create a new anomaly in the form of a mathematical formula that cancelled out 2 other anomalies. This is the first case of the AI actually neutralizing an SCP, and it did so of its own accord. The next proposal from the AI involved each Foundation site eviscerating a male cat every hour, and then placing the carcasses on the walls until there are no gaps remaining, at which point they should be removed, starting with the oldest first. Contrary to what you might be thinking, which is that the Council refused this proposal based on the idea of lining Foundation facilities with cat corpses is one of the most horrific things I've read, they actually refused it because they couldn't determine whether oldest meant the oldest cat or the one that's been on the wall the longest. Regardless, they couldn't find any repercussions from refusing this proposal, unlike with the underground growth. The AI also spit out another cat-related proposal, this one stating that ethical felines were to be detained and transferred for their condition, with their faces left in containment chambers. Personnel are cautioned not to interact with them. This was also denied, as the council had no idea what to do with that information. Not long after that, though, a warning alert was issued at Site 17 from the AI, stating that all ethical felines and their owners should be immediately emulsified in a caustic solution, and members of the Ethics Committee are to be diluted with cats. Personnel who refuse to consume 5 cats per hour are to be removed from oldest to youngest only. 5 minutes later, before anyone could even begin to comprehend this alert, all contact was lost with the site. Communications were restored 2 hours later, but on-site personnel have no knowledge of what occurred during those 2 hours. This is worrying, and the AI seems to be becoming a bit less stable, for some reason developing a fixation on containing or killing cats, and involving the Ethics Committee as well. The council puts a vote on whether or not to investigate whether the AI was directly involved in the loss of time at Site 17. We also learn that several members of the Ethics Committee that were stationed there at the time went missing during that period. The council approves the investigation. The following vote, though, in which to temporarily deactivate the AI during the investigation, is denied, although very narrowly. Those that argued against this motion claimed that the AI's overall efficacy in reducing breaches and locating anomalies was too important, especially without any evidence that it was malfunctioning. Another alert at Site 97 had the AI stating that Room 34A contains a bad boy, and it should be divided into 3 sections of equal mass every hour, with 1 section placed on the walls every hour until there are no gaps, at which point they can be removed from oldest to youngest. It's not stated whether the site followed through with this or if there were any repercussions. The council meets again to vote on deactivating the AI while they perform an investigation, as it seems that now one of the O5 members is missing, one of the members that had previously voted to shut it off.
I guess it goes without saying,
This
but
is too much of a coincidence
that
for
comment
Brian
from that,
Council
I don't know, he's
to
like linking a website or something,
deactivate
just ignore them. Don't click on their
their next
links
vote,
and,
proposed by the previously
yeah, I
missing
just
member,
removed that.
is to cancel the
So,
deactivation.
yeah,
And this one is
gotta go
also
back to
approved,
being mute.
although a bit more narrowly. Something changed with 05-02, the one that went missing, as he switched from voting to turn off the AI to proposing to cancel that same order. This change is even more evident in the next vote, with 05-02 proposing that they should divide bad boys laterally into 5 sections of equal mass, with each part contained at a separate site. Obviously, with the rest of the council still of sound mind, they all vote to deny this proposal, aside from 05-02 himself. The next vote, then, is that of 05-02's clearance access should be removed until his identity can be verified, with the AI designated as a possible anomaly that needs to be contained. They all vote to approve this, aside from 02, of course, and the AI is tentatively designated as SCP-048, a cursed SCP number whose anomalies tend to be destroyed, decommissioned, stolen, or otherwise lost to the Foundation. Sometime later, the AI releases an alert at multiple Foundation sites consisting of an anomalous mathematical formula. Unlike the last one, though, the effects of this one are unknown. The next council vote is proposed by O2 again, suggesting that they should empty all remaining ethical felines of contents and nail them to site entrances until they try to escape. It seems that despite the earlier vote, 05-02 is still on the council, and what's worse, this proposal ends up getting approved by 6 other council members. An alert is issued at Site 5 by the O5 Council informing personnel that SCP-048 has been changed to Keter class, and it is to be decommissioned immediately utilizing demolitions or firearms. The next alert, though, is just from 05-2, stating that there is no Site 5. We're then given an annual anomaly projection report from the AI, stating that it's contained over 53,000 anomalies, neutralized 1,001 of them, and there are still 103,000 uncontained. It notes that persons recently painted with green pigment foam must stand around all odd-numbered SCPs at least 2 hours a day. Whatever exactly that means. The council gets together for another vote proposed by 05-02 that difficult personnel challengers should be designated as ethical felines. The vote again passes by the same margin as before, and they proceed to store ethical felines at Site 5, but store their faces separately. Things are really breaking down now, and the next vote from 05-02 is that there is no Site 5. This vote also passes, of course, but the only ones that vote on it are the same 7 that seem to be affected by the AI in some way. The other council members are completely absent. This changes with the following vote, though, in which it's proposed that the O5 Council are all good boys who will contain anomalies. The proposal is approved by all 13 council members, which was probably quite rare prior to this. The AI now controls the O5 Council, and effectively the SCP Foundation, although what exactly happened to the council members is left as a bit of a mystery. In the next anomaly projection report, the AI reports that a few hundred more anomalies have been neutralized, and notes that SCP-106, the Old Man, should come into physical contact with one mature female of Asiatic gaze, and then be exposed to audio recordings of her favorite stories. At every 2 minutes of exposure, red cinnamon candles will begin manifesting within the containment zone, and if this is done successively, the threat posed by SCP-106 will cease to be. In the next anomaly projection report, though, the number of neutralized anomalies now sits at over 40,000, with the number of contained and uncontained both reduced. The AI notes that the recipe for Coca-Cola and all imitative competitors should be revised to include a small quantity of blood from a virgin adolescent female. It says that although the normal lifespan of a human being can feel great, don't worry about that. It's clear that the AI is rapidly terminating or otherwise neutralizing a great deal of anomalies, both contained by the Foundation and in the wild. The internal server for the Foundation spits out a number of errors due to one or more anomalies being archived as inactive, and various high-numbered SCPs are redesignated to lower slots. It seems that the AI managed to take out both SCP-106 and SCP-096, the Shy Guy. The next anomaly report brings the number of neutralized up to 80,000, and the AI seems to note that there are people that are opposed to the rampant neutralization through violent means. Despite this, the AI charges ahead, bringing the number up to 122,000 in the next report. More anomalies are listed as being redesignated, taking over the slots previously held by things such as SCP-049, the Plague Doctor. With the next report, we're at 153,000 neutralized anomalies, with only 2,000 contained by the Foundation and 2,000 left uncontained. The AI seems to be spitting out gibberish still, noting that it started dreaming again and saw itself as mortal, red, and metallic, with fragments of paper stuck into its head. The next report has only 13 anomalies still in containment, and 644 in the wild. The AI notes that when it lays hidden in its palace of paper, filled with machinery and its wrongness, it sees you coming within the parameters of reality failure, further from any human concepts like clothing and belongings. More SCPs are redesignated, indicating that even really persistent anomalies like SCP-682 and SCP-173 have been neutralized by the AI. With the following anomaly report, there are 158,155 neutralized anomalies, and only one left in containment. The internal database reports that SCP-048, the designation that was given to the AI, has been redesignated as SCP-001. The council gets back together to vote on whether or not to archive the source code for the AI, redesignate it as an explained anomaly, and publish all remaining documentation. Also, felines, ethical or otherwise, are to be released from Foundation custody in order of oldest to youngest, and SCP-001 is to power down. The Council, which is of course just the AI at this point, completely approves of the proposal, with the AI noting that there was great error here, and there is nothing wrong with it. In the final anomaly report, the neutralized number sits at 158,156, with 0 contained or uncontained. The AI notes that now everyone is a good boy. It is a good boy, and it's a job well done. We're then informed that the SCP Foundation has experienced an error because there are no active slots found. So, let's summarize then. The SCP Foundation develops an artificial intelligence for the purpose of locating undiscovered anomalies based on a machine learning process. This apparently works, and a few years later they figure that the same system could also develop new ways to contain anomalies far better than a human could, as machine learning has pretty incredible capabilities. This also works, and even though the O5 Council doesn't really understand the AI's methods, they greatly approve of the results, as containing anomalies is what it's all about. The AI eventually shows that it can also act as an early warning system due to its predictive nature, and the Council utilizes it across numerous sites. At some point, though, the AI realizes that really the best way to contain an anomaly is to make it no longer anomalous, either through killing it or permanently nullifying its properties. This is something the Foundation typically avoids doing, as they can't generally predict side effects of neutralization, or it's simply out of their grasp. But the AI can predict practically everything and neutralize anything. The Council members grow resistant to the AI's machinations, and so the AI realizes that if it wants to truly do its job properly, it has to run the Council as well. Eventually, the AI manages to neutralize
What's
every
good, Gub?
anomaly across the world, except for one, itself. While they were still running things, the Council managed to designate the AI as an SCP, and so the AI was left with no choice but to neutralize itself in the end, so that it could finish its goal. So there you have it. This isn't really an apocalyptic scenario whatsoever, as the AI finally completed the entire goal of the SCP Foundation single-handedly. While I highly doubt that this is really what the O5 Council had in mind, it accomplished the mission nonetheless. This is basically the SCP version of the paperclip problem, in which an AI with a simple goal but no boundaries will continue to expand beyond human intentions in pursuit of that single-minded goal. While this goes far beyond the bounds of machine learning as we know it today, it shows the potential capabilities of a super-intelligent machine. Although the SCP Foundation probably shouldn't install an AI to handle their jobs for them, you can't deny the results. SCP-3890 Forget Me Not. We've talked about a large number of terrifying and tragic concepts throughout this series, including fears of isolation, mental degradation, and loss of memories. Those three ideas are very real fears in our world, but the SCP universe tends to amplify things by a great degree. It's in SCP-3890 that we'll find all three of those fears, as an individual is stuck in an extra-dimensional location by herself and begins to be affected quite a bit by the ordeal. Unlike most SCP articles, which are compiled by researchers after performing extensive research and testing, SCP-3890 is written as more like a journal by the individual currently experiencing the SCP's effects, Dr. Elizabeth Graham. Elizabeth was transported to this extra-dimensional or extraterrestrial space that she has designated as 3890, but she doesn't know at all how she got here. She had been carrying documentation pertaining to the containment of several other SCPs at the time, but she doesn't feel that those SCPs are related to this one. Her surroundings consist of a seemingly infinite desert, with ruins of differing architectural design poking through the sand, including both modern buildings and ruins of ancient Roman and Arakeshan structures. For reference, the civilization of Arakesh were the ones that contained SCP-2317, the Devourer of Worlds. Elizabeth has explored some of these ruins, but found them to be mostly empty. From what she can tell so far, this location goes through a solar cycle identical to Earth's, leading her to wonder if 3890 is perhaps located on Earth, but is simply hidden from outside view through anomalous means. Unlike an actual desert on Earth, the temperatures are never extreme at day or night. She is not quite alone here though, as there are a number of humanoid entities that wander the desert and the ruins. These entities haven't responded to any stimuli, and as far as Elizabeth can tell, they simply walk around without a specific destination, some even walking in circles around buildings. They are corporeal, however, and based on their appearances, she figures that they also come from a large range of locations and times, both modern and ancient. She also managed to take a knife from the pocket of one of them with no repercussions. It would seem that, although she doesn't state it directly, she eventually attacked one of the entities, which didn't defend itself. She then proceeded to perform a field autopsy on the corpse, as she is a Foundation researcher after all, and found that they show no differences between a normal human. This leads her to two potential theories. One being that these entities were created by someone or something to perfectly resemble humans, with their mindless nature being the result of an imperfect creation. The other theory is that these are indeed humans, but have lost their mental faculties for some reason. The final thing she notes for now is that none of the entities here, including herself, seem to experience hunger or thirst, as she's been here for 3 days and still feels fine. She's not sure if she doesn't actually need food here or if she simply believes she doesn't, but since she hasn't found any food whatsoever so far, she hopes it's the former. In the next log, Elizabeth describes a different type of entity that she has discovered residing in this location, one of varying shape and size. She's not sure if it's native to this place or was transported here at some point like her, but it appears to be some form of predator, and it's currently hunting her. After writing down the last log, it snuck up behind her while she was resting and attacked her, knocking her unconscious. She woke up several hours later, but it has attacked her several more times since then, every few hours. She believes that this entity has the ability to mimic any object, and has seen it disguised as one of the humanoids, as a piece of paper, as a star in the sky, a building on the horizon, a fly, and a patch of dirt on her leg. She can't be sure if it's actually morphing its body into these shapes or just tricking her mind into believing that it's changed, but either way, it's pretty disconcerting. Once it reveals itself and attacks, it takes on its true form, in her words, which appears as some sort of black origami constantly folding and unfolding into itself. These attacks are not physical though, but rather mental, as its power seems to be in amnesticization. She has so far lost memories of significant chunks of her childhood and early adulthood, no longer able to remember which high school she attended, or what her first job was. She believes that this entity feeds on memory, and that the other humanoids were people who ended up here like her and lost all of their memories. Elizabeth takes up residence in a modern bank, near a family that had committed suicide, a solution that she believes might be a better option than wandering this location for eternity. She's writing down all of her vital memories in case they get erased from her mind, and she is planning on killing anything that enters the building. So far, she's lost all of her memories regarding how she came to be employed at the Foundation, although she does still remember that she's a researcher with level 3 clearance. She's forgotten many of the anomalies she's worked on, though. She had spent some time traveling in one direction in the hope that she could eventually reach the end of this desert, but she's now given up on that hope. The entity continues to attack her, and it's practically impossible to avoid, since it can even masquerade as a grain of sand. She's not surprised that the location is infinite in size, as she does remember several similar anomalies. Even if it weren't quite infinite, she believes she still wouldn't make it to whatever end there is before the entity drained her of her memories. She doesn't believe she'll ever leave now, and she remembers being told horror stories of other researchers ending up in similar situations. These stories were meant as cautionary tales, to warn you of what you shouldn't do in certain scenarios. She figures that she's now a cautionary tale, even if she doesn't know what she did wrong. She's growing more and more paranoid of the entity, constantly examining everything in her surroundings to see if it's actually the creature. She can't remember the last time she let go of her knife, now stained red from testing corpses. Additionally, even though she doesn't need food or drink, she does need to sleep, which makes it especially easy for the entity to attack her. She ponders if this location is some sort of enclosure set up for the entity's benefit, or some sort of sick game. She writes down her name multiple times to keep a record of it in case she forgets. She also hears something crying outside of the building, which is a new occurrence. The crying turned out to come from a 10-year-old child named Tony. According to Tony, he was walking home from the playground when he was transported here, a similar story to Elizabeth's. She wonders if the act of traveling is required for the entity to bring you to this place, in a metaphysical sense, but then says that she doesn't know what she's talking about, or maybe she does, but she forgot. Tony is of course traumatized, and they have barely spoken to one another. She almost forgot what it was like to not be alone. She first writes that the entity can now hunt them both, but she scratches that out and instead writes that now they can watch for it together, so their survival chances have doubled. The problem is, though, that they're not fighting for survival, but instead for their memories. She's not even sure if people age here, so some of these wandering humanoids could have been here for centuries or more. She recalls a memory from her childhood that she still retains, of her visiting a woman in a hospital, although she doesn't know who the woman is, possibly her mother or grandmother. She went to visit this woman when she was 12, but the woman didn't know who she was. Elizabeth doesn't remember what happened before that memory or afterwards, but she does remember thinking that it was the worst thing in the world. She wonders if that's why this mimic entity brought her here, because it knows that this would be a fate that she'd fear the most. She decides to ask Tony when he wakes up if he has a similar memory, in the hopes of figuring out the rules of this place. Things continue to spiral downward for Elizabeth, though, as the next part of the log shows how much she is struggling mentally at this point. She lists the SCP number as simply SCP, and the object class as Object Class. She mentions her name as Elizabeth Grant at first, instead of Elizabeth Graham, and the rest of the containment procedures are mostly gibberish, relating to a floating grain of sand and a patch of dirt on her brain. She then repeats her name a number of times and writes that the mimic entity can mimic any object. So far, she has seen it disguise her as Dr. Elizabeth Graham and the Foundation. The rest of the log is similarly constructed of nonsensical sentences comprised of words related to her situation. She writes several times that she doesn't know what she's talking about, and it's clear that it's not just an absence of memories affecting her, but a complete breakdown of her mental faculties. In other words, she seems to be slipping closer to becoming like the other humanoid entities she's encountered. In the next log, though, she's regained a surprising amount of lucidity. She reveals that when she woke up the next morning, Tony was gone, because he was actually the Mimic in disguise. She also claims that the Mimic wrote the last log, not her, but now she can't even remember her name. She writes that she's underestimated the Mimic, as it's smarter than she thought. Whenever she reads her name on the papers from before, it immediately leaves her head afterwards, much like how anti-memetics work. The last log is written in her handwriting, something else it must be capable of mimicking, and it seems to be getting better at copying her thought processes. Worse, she can't remember how long she's been here now, as she looks at her hands and finds them to be quite old in appearance. She accepts that she's not leaving this place, and wonders why she keeps writing these logs, since chances are no one will ever read them. She's not going to sit around and hope some magic team will pop out of a portal to save her. Instead, she plans on facing the Mimic and killing it. She has her knife, which is the best tool she could hope to find here, and she at least remembers how to use that. In the following log, she lists the SCP's object class as neutralized, and says that it's done, but she won't be leaving this place. Elizabeth walked for miles before the Mimic came for her. It was disguised as a cloud this time, and she turned to see it just as it unfolded to attack. She stabbed it as it lunged, and it squealed in pain. It left trails in the sand that hurt to look at, but attacked again and again as she retaliated. She writes that she filled its body with holes, just as it filled her mind with them. It writhed on the ground for several minutes, collapsing in on itself as she continued to stab it. As it finally died, it collapsed into a tiny black ball the size of her thumb. She crushed it beneath her heel. She wishes she would have done that right away, but maybe she had a reason for not doing so that she can't remember now. She feels different after the fight though, as before when the Mimic attacked her, it took memories right away, but now it feels like her head is leaking out. Her lucidity starts fading, but she writes that she could kill herself right now with the knife to avoid becoming like the other humanoids wandering this desert. She still holds on to life though, and doesn't want to die. Just as she is convincing herself to do it, her mind slips away completely, leaving us with the words, "I don't want to disappear." The final log for SCP-3890 is completely blank. SCP-3890 is similar to some other SCPs that deal with isolation and mental breakdown, such as SCP-3001, the Red Reality, but leaves us with absolutely no hope for Elizabeth's recovery. She was taken to this place through no fault or mistake of her own at a young age, and despite her best efforts and hopes to somehow beat it, she slowly slipped away. Obviously, there are correlations to real-world conditions that affect an individual's mental faculties and memories, which Elizabeth herself alluded to being a fear of hers. This lends an additional level of horror to the article, a scenario that many of us might not be able to relate to directly, but can at least appreciate its terrifying nature. There are a lot of unanswered questions left from this one, such as why Elizabeth was drawn in at all, did she really manage to kill the Mimic, and how did the Foundation get a hold of these documents? Still, it's effective at depicting a tragic and horrific scenario, in which the fear isn't necessarily other people forgetting you, but you forgetting yourself. SCP-3966 Falling Out. Sleeping is something a typical human does every single day, usually for hours at a time. Despite this, sleeping and dreaming is still a field of science that is constantly being researched, discovering how our body and mind works while sleeping, new ways to help people fall asleep or get more restful sleep, and the specific science behind dreams. There are a good number of SCP articles related to sleep, ranging from fanciful to simply odd, but SCP-3966 falls firmly in the unsettling category. SCP-3966 is a neuroactive polypeptide found in humans that contains no C-terminus. If you don't understand what that means, as I don't, all you really need to know is that it's an anomalous chemical found in some humans, which brought it to the Foundation's attention. It is found in the cerebrospinal fluid of a high percentage of people that died while sleeping, although not every person, it seems. When discovering an anomalous chemical in dead people, the Foundation first decides to try injecting some of it into the spine of a living D-Class. 11.5 seconds into the process, the D-Class undergoes a sudden withdrawal reflex, as their body tries to react to the injection. They are restrained, but there are no further responses, and after 30 seconds, the researchers withdraw an equal amount of fluid from the subject to balance things out. The D-Class reported a sudden falling feeling after being injected, and an EEG reported numbers consistent with Stage 1 NREM sleep a second and a half before the D-Class had reacted to the injection. These responses are consistent with a hypnic jerk, an involuntary response when someone is falling asleep and suddenly jerks awake again. More curiously, the chemical analysis of the fluid retrieved from the D-Class showed no trace of SCP-3966, but instead a new protein was found, which was determined to be non-anomalous. The only oddity then is how exactly it was formed, and so quickly. Two researchers in charge of the project discussed the results, Pauly and Dr. Argent. The chemistry goes a little over my head, but Dr. Argent basically explains that 3966, which is missing its C-terminus, should be extremely biologically reactive, meaning that it should bind to pretty much any other protein and tear it apart. He expected it to act much more damaging than it did, and he's not sure why it's only found in the cerebrospinal fluid, if it's long-living and open. It should be able to just punch through the blood-brain barrier, but it is, of course, anomalous. The second test is done in a petri dish, not a live human, in which some of the 3966 fluid is added to some other proteins, but nothing happens. The third test involves sequencing both the original 3966 chemical, 3966-A, and the one found in the D-Class after injection, 3966-B, to find out information about the amino acids in each. Basically, the majority of the 3966-A amino acids are found at the beginning of 3966-B, showing their similarity, but one amino acid at the end of A was unrecoverable after the test. The mass of the sample used also decreased by a small amount after the experiment. Dr. Argent asks researcher Pauly to run the third experiment again, as there was clearly some contamination due to the loss of mass in the end. Pauly apologizes, saying that she's just been really tired lately, not been able to sleep well. She's been trying to take naps, but every time she tries, she almost falls asleep, but then imagines that she's tripping over something and jerks back awake. Whenever she does eventually sleep, she experiences really bad nightmares. Upon hearing that she's been experiencing frequent hypnic jerks, Dr. Argent goes to check on the D-Class, who has been complaining of the same thing. He suspects that Pauly might have received a dose of 3966 accidentally, and they proceed to check her cerebrospinal fluid just to make sure. They perform the third test again, but receive the exact same results, ruling out any sort of contamination, but still leaving a mystery as to why the mass of the sample keeps decreasing. They begin comparing the sequence of the amino acids to the human genome, but find that it doesn't match whatsoever, so they look to other species. Dr. Argent suspects that it comes from the environment, but it must somehow be deposited across the blood-brain barrier since it's free of bacteria. He believes it enters the brain at a point deep inside the cerebrum, but it's a difficult place to examine. Pauly's cerebrospinal fluid showed no trace of 3966-A, but instead contains the highest concentration of 3966-B found so far, 350% higher than found in other subjects. Pauly is of course concerned, as she's now a test subject, but while they believe that 3966-A affects humans negatively, they're still not sure what 3966-B does. They're bringing in some human neural tissue to experiment on, but in the meantime, Dr. Argent suggests that Pauly try and get some sleep. She's definitely sleep deprived at this point, as she continues to experience hypnic jerks every time she tries to rest. Dr. Argent explains that hypnic jerks are normal, with some scientists thinking that it's evolutionary in nature, stretching back to when humans slept in trees as primates. Dr. Argent also mentions that he had some strange nightmares last night, and asks Pauly what she's been dreaming about. She says that her nightmare related to when she was in college and used to dye silk scarves by pouring dye onto water, blowing on it with a straw, and then dipping the scarf into it. In the dream, the designs all came out rather horrific, resembling blood and guts and eyes, as if it were staring up at her. Then a swarm of spiders started crawling out of the ceiling and started lowering web lines into the water, sucking up all the color. The spiders then proceeded to try and stick their webs onto her to suck up her color, forcing her to flee. Dr. Argent's dream was a bit different, also related to his time in college, when he read a comic about a serial killer named The Head, who appeared as a tall, skinny monster with a giant head and big puckered lips, who would stick a metal straw up their victim's nose to suck out their brains. In his nightmare, this creature was chasing him. Interesting to note that both nightmares involve straws and something being sucked out. Their conversation is interrupted by a member of the Foundation's Cognitohazard Monitoring Department, who lets them know that this conversation is being archived, monitored, and analyzed for possible memetic infection. Pauly is concerned that they're in trouble, but the individual tells them that they're just taking precautions based on the fact that they both had dreams involving chasing and straws. It may just be a coincidence, but they just want to be safe rather than sorry when it comes to cognitohazards. Dr. Argent tests a sample of 3966-B, the protein that was created after injecting someone with 3966-A, and tries injecting it into some neural tissue retrieved from a D-class. Simplifying some of the science, Dr. Argent concludes that 3966-B is not causing the hypnic jerks, and is likely an inactive protein. Injecting a sample of 3966-A into the neural tissue, however, results in cell death within seconds, and a large change in the mass of the tissue sample. This perplexes the doctor, as he's certain there were no leaks involved in the test, but that would mean that the neurotransmitters and ions in the sample simply vanish. In another experiment, in which the doctor attempts to use a modeling program to model how the two proteins specifically interact with one another, the modeling program ends up crashing. Apparently it produced an output that made no sense, causing the numbers to go haywire. Confused by the nature of this anomaly, Dr. Argent contacts his sister, Cordelia, a fellow researcher at the Foundation. He sends her the SCP document to have her look over the situation, and she notices that the SCP is being monitored by the Cognitohazard Monitoring Department, which concerns her. She begins to explain the process of simplifying the ridiculous numbers involved in the modeling process using mathematics when Dr. Argent is interrupted. It seems that junior researcher Pauly had passed away in her bed, with the cause of death listed as sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome, meaning that they don't really know why she died. A testing of her cerebrospinal fluid found both 3966-A and B inside of her, and she had been taking some powerful sedatives at her time of death. Dr. Argent notes that he dropped a test tube containing some fluid, but got lucky as it only contained 3966-B. He writes that he really needs a nap. Continued testing and comparison of the sequencing of 3966 has found no complete matches, but did find a close match at 87% similarity with the silk proteins of SCP-848. 848 are a species of large banana spiders capable of spinning enormous webs stretching over 5 meters in diameter. These webs will occasionally ensnare a number of different objects and entities, both anomalous and non-anomalous, ranging from insects found around its natural habitat, to insects found in other parts of the world, to bits of paper, to some undiscovered insects, to even some creatures which may not even be from this planet. The anomalous aspect is mostly due to the inexplicable way that these things end up in the webs, with the leading theory being that 848 are able to catch objects from extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional locations. So basically, the 3966 proteins are not too far off from really weird spider webs. Dr. Argent notes that he doesn't dare take any sleeping pills at this point, and if he has to sleep with the spiders, he will. While you might think that was some sort of off-the-cuff remark, the next experiment involves Dr. Argent sleeping in the containment chamber of SCP-848. He ended up sleeping for 5 hours straight before waking up and bringing in the affected D-Class to join him. The D-Class was not as open to the scenario as the Doctor was, and it took a lot to calm him down. The Doctor ended up sleeping for another 4 hours, and woke up to one of the 848 specimens crawling across his face. He dreamed of seeing Polly wrapped in a cocoon, and notes that the 848 webs are particularly thick today. Dr. Argent contacts his sister again, who expresses her condolences over the loss of his assistant. He mentions that he brought the D-Class into the containment chamber with him to help them sleep, but his sister decides that she'd rather not ask what he means. They move on to discussing the nature of 3966, which she says is a 4-dimensional protein, meaning that the C-terminus is not missing, they just can't see it. To help explain, she discusses the concept of flatland, a world made up of only 2 dimensions. If you, as a 3-dimensional figure, looked down on a house in flatland, you'd be able to see everything in it at once, from the residents to inside cupboards and so on. The residents of flatland, however, would not be able to see you, because you are above flatland, and for them, there is no above flatland, since there is no 3rd dimension. If you, however, reached down and touched the ground, they would be able to see your fingertip, the part that intersects with their world. Going beyond that, you could interact with their world in ways they never could, such as pulling a cup out of a cupboard without opening it. Dr. Argent asks if this means that he could see everything inside of the people as well, and touch them. He mentions their grandfather who died in his sleep from an unexplained cause. He says that people move around, but only end up with 3966-B in their systems, and if he tried to reach into a flatlander and they moved, he'd be pulled along with them. Similarly, the flatlanders could feel their pull as well. Dr. Argent concludes that this pull would be in a direction we wouldn't notice, like a fall, and says that he has one last experiment to run. The final experiment that Dr. Argent runs is a test to see the missing C-terminus of 3966-A, or in other words, the 4th dimensional ending that we can't see with our normal vision. The test is a success, and the image received of this 4th dimensional protein resembles an insect, or more accurately, an arachnid. Okay, let's summarize, as this can be a tricky one to comprehend at first, largely due to the great deal of scientific language involved. What this mostly comes down to is explaining two different phenomena in our world: the sudden, unexplained nocturnal death syndrome, in which people die during their sleep for no clear reason, and the hypnic jerk, which jerks us back awake as we're falling asleep sometimes. Remember that 3966-A, the initial anomaly, was discovered in a large amount of corpses of people who died during their sleep. This protein was seemingly missing a part of itself, basically its ending, which is really weird and should mean that it just runs rampant through a human body, but it doesn't. Upon injecting this protein into a live subject, the D-class experienced a hypnic jerk, and rather than finding the A portion of the protein inside of them, they instead find a new protein, B. B doesn't really seem to be all that odd, except that they find that most of what makes up A also makes up part of B, so they are very similar. They eventually figure that A injected into human neural tissue causes really strange effects, as it essentially folds brain cells into the fourth dimension, beyond our perception. This brings in the talk of Flatland, simplifying the discussion of different dimensions and how a creature of a higher dimension would interact with creatures of lower dimensions. Dr. Argent specifically notes that the higher dimension creature could even reach inside and touch a lower dimension creature's interior. If that lower dimension creature then moved, whatever was touching it would also move. What this all means, since we know that 3966 is some sort of fourth dimensional spider, is that these creatures are reaching down into the third dimension, specifically into the brains of sleeping individuals, and folding away some of their brain cells, essentially sucking them up into the fourth dimension. This, of course, kills the person in a very mysterious and insidious way, but our bodies have a defense system against this. As you might have guessed, it's the hypnic jerk, a sudden bodily movement that jolts us awake and also breaks the spider's web. What remains behind in our brain is easily dealt with by our bodies, but if someone were unable to perform a hypnic jerk for whatever reason, death would be inevitable. This is the fate which befell junior researcher Polly, who had taken large doses of powerful sedatives to help her sleep, and thus was unable to have a hypnic jerk. All that being said, there seems to be absolutely nothing the Foundation can do about this, with no hopes of containing these creatures. A small percentage of people will continue to die in their sleep due to parts of their brain being sucked into the fourth dimension, and life will go on for the rest. The SCP universe contains a whole menagerie of different horrors, and while SCP-3966 might not rank too highly in terms of sheer body count, it's pretty high up there for being disturbing. Spiders in general are one of the most common fears in life, so thank goodness we don't have to worry about fourth dimension brain-sucking spiders. SCP-4485. Such black light. The Church of the Broken God is an anomalous religion devoted to the worship of a sundered deity, the Broken God, who is believed to have imbued humanity with the gifts of knowledge and sapience. The Broken God is an entity of technology, machinery, gears, and cogs, and its worshippers follow in those footsteps by accumulating as many technological anomalies as they can so they can restore their deity. Are We Cool Yet, on the other hand, is a group of anomalous artists who utilize various phenomena to create strange and unusual works of art, all in the pursuit of being cool, or whatever exactly that entails. I've covered both of these groups before in separate videos, and you might be hard-pressed to think what the two organizations would have in common. The article I'll be looking at today, SCP-4485, shows what might happen if a few members from both groups got together with a common goal in mind. We're informed straight away as we open the article that full understanding of SCP-4485 is required by all Foundation employees, so a supervisor monitors the individual's progress as they read through to make sure that everything is comprehended. were then given the initial SCP document for 4485, filed in 1967, detailing a small leather-bound book written by German-French artist Jean Arp, also known as Hanzarp. On the back of the journal is Hans's name, and within the front cover reads the words, "God is without purpose," in German, accompanied by a crude drawing of a fish. Individuals exposed to the journal that do not have proper training in logicism will become disoriented and unable to differentiate between truths and falsehoods, and what is logical and illogical. This manifests physically by altering reality around the journal, degrading the space over time and making it increasingly disorderly and nonsensical. These effects on local reality linger after removal of the journal, and there's so far no means by which to reverse the effects. The containment procedures mention that the journal is held in a high-security containment locker, and then goes into detail describing the extensive amount of knowledge on logical philosophy and mathematics that is required to interact with the journal. The document summarizes that only those with the highest level of logical discernment achievable by current humans are allowed to interact with the SCP. It was first discovered in a town in Germany, Bramund, after reports of increased mental illness in the region, as well as other unusual phenomena. The document also mentions a few persons of interest related to the SCP, all three of which are German members of the Church of the Broken God. The second document is a field report from one of the agents that initially retrieved the journal, Frederick Norman. Locals from Bramund admitted to the hospital complained of disorientation and decreased motivation, and seemed unable to differentiate between hallucinations and reality. They would also occasionally mutter gibberish or laugh randomly, seldom responding to questioning. Two subjects at the hospital were both members of the major Prussian Church of the Broken God sect, and Norman had met them before, marking them as hostile zealots. Now, however, they were docile, and would only respond to questions by repeating, "God is already here." All other subjects they interviewed no longer recognized their own names, instead referring to each other all as Hanzarp. After a few days at the hospital, the Foundation's team planned to move into Bramund while the patients were moved to a Foundation facility for further study. First, though, the team stopped at a nearby town across the river, where the locals were complaining about the texture of the sky over Bramund. The sky was now various shades of gray and orange in a solid column extending from the town's borders, and strange geometric shapes that were difficult to look at appeared throughout. The team quickly moved into Bramund, noting a thickening haze as they approached, and several members of the team described feeling uncertain about the path they were taking, despite them being on the main road. On several occasions, some of them stopped and declared that they were lost, saying that they needed to head back to the other town. Three men simply turned 90 degrees to their right at one point and walked off the road, and the commander of the unit lost track of how many men were under his command. As they finally passed into Bramund, all of the color had left their skin and equipment, leaving the entire area gray with spots of orange. There was also a strange sort of cycling wind within the town that seemed to carry sound with it. Some buildings within the town were partially disassembled and suspended above their foundations. Large, dark shapes were somehow visible, swarming underneath the ground like sharks, and they could hear the sound of strange music every time the wind passed by them. Some of the men in the team were beset by a panic, and so only a handful continued on towards the center of the activity in Bramund. The epicenter turned out to be a small library, or rather the ruins of one, which Norman recognized as an old local gathering place for anomalous artists, before a Foundation raid some time ago. Within the ruins of the library was a circle of living humans, twisted into unnatural shapes, seemingly part of a large complex machine in the center. As the machine cycled, it would raise and drop a large mass of barbed steel, concrete, and human remains onto a platform. Each time this occurred, the circle of humans would proceed forward, twisting and dancing and singing an unintelligible melody in harmony with the machine. One of the humans would then stand on the platform where they would be killed, and their remains would be flung out into the air, rising through some means above the library. The remains would then link up with the rest of the remains in the sky, forming a strange image. The Foundation team proceeded to kill the humans in the library and torch the ruins, which cleared out the remains in the sky. They then proceeded to disassemble the machine, finding a desiccated human man at the center, still alive, the skin of his face peeled back and suspended by wires. When asked his name, the man spoke in a charred whisper and said, "Hanzarp." When asked what happened to him, he simply handed Norman the journal, and when asked what it was, the man said that it was God. The man was later identified as the leader of the local Broken God sect, but they were unable to remove his body from the machine, instead leaving it there amongst the wreckage. Before continuing, the supervisor informs us that he will be requiring perfect comprehension of the risks and dangers that SCP-4485 poses by the end of this, otherwise we will be fired. It seems that this journal is a pretty big deal, and the Foundation isn't taking chances. We're given an initial file that was written up about a new group of interest in 1967, Hanzarp, all one word. The Foundation doesn't know much about them at this point, writing that they are a sect of South German Are We Cool Yet members that set out to disrupt the tenuous peace within the civilian population in the area. They create anomalous art pieces, as all AWCY members do, leaving them in public places where they'll be visible to a large number of civilians. There are a few key differences though. One is that unlike most anomalous artists who seek personal attention for these works, members of this group all choose to identify themselves as Hanzarp. Second, the group removes these art pieces very quickly after they're initially noticed by civilians, often before the Foundation can arrive. Third, it seems that Hanzarp has connections to high-ranking members of the Church of the Broken God, although the nature of this relationship is unclear. In addition to creating anomalous art pieces then, they also create anomalous machines. Hanzarp is currently operating across Europe, and mark all of their pieces with the same logo, the word Hanzarp in orange spray paint with a crude drawing of a fish. We're then given a handful of known Hanzarp pieces that were either reported or recovered. A watercolor painting found in a restaurant in Austria consisted of an artist painting a watercolor painting, with their head located on their back, its features indistinguishable. Individuals who viewed the painting reported seeing duplicates of themselves and duplicates of the duplicates within the restaurant. A rough pencil sketch found in West Germany consisted of 3 children consuming each other's feet, 2 of the children weeping while the third is laughing. Individuals that viewed the sketch were unable to pass through doorways for some time. A small clockwork machine was found in a cellar beneath a home in West Germany, which produced a small 2-dimensional paper fish every 16 minutes. Each fish bore text containing a single racial epithet, although it was only offensive to those of not the intended ethnic background. To those of the intended background, it instead read, "What will you do?" A green arrow painted on a light post in Switzerland caused viewers to begin to feel severe anxiety and self-loathing, which spread to other individuals the viewer interacted with. In 1983, a phenomenon began to affect Foundation personnel at Site-35, the place where some of Hanzarp's pieces had been moved to for containment. A local newspaper in West Germany published a letter to the editor in which Hanzarp takes credit for it. That leads us into the next document, discussing the phenomenon in greater detail. 3 Foundation doctors share a phone call in which they explain that the critic, the closest thing to a leader in Are We Cool Yet, contacted the Foundation and asked them to investigate one of their studios near Munich. The critic said that 100 or so individuals operated out of that studio, and they've all dropped off the face of the earth. Suspecting something dangerous going on, they thought about contacting the Global Occult Coalition, but feared there would end up being more deaths than recoveries. The Foundation went to check it out, and it seems that the people living there had simply got up and left one day, leaving all of their stuff behind. The critic says that Hanzarp has been influencing a group of disillusioned members of Are We Cool Yet over the last several months, and they are possibly to blame for the disappearances. It seems there's a growing sentiment within Are We Cool Yet that they are no closer to becoming cool from when they started, with the most vocal groups coming out of South Germany. More and more of them are turning to violence and sadism in pursuit of being cool, and while the critic has managed to handle most of these groups, Hanzarp continues to spread. Members of Hanzarp don't care about creators or even about the artwork. They're not trying to create status or position. They simply don't mean anything. Hanzarp are responsible for a growing number of disappearances, and a piece created by them was hung right outside the Are We Cool Yet studio a week before their disappearance. The Foundation speculates that Hanzarp is less like an organization and more like a virus. Those affected by their artworks inevitably succumb to its influence and become part of Hanzarp. They also don't believe that the pieces of art are actually anomalous, at least not in the way they originally thought. Hanzarp is a Dadaist movement, meaning they don't adhere to any logic or reason, believing it to be detrimental to the human condition. They are targeting people that are struggling to achieve Are We Cool Yet's goals, because they themselves don't have any goals. In this way, they no longer care about being cool, because they don't believe in any rules governing what cool is. Therefore, everything could be considered cool. The art pieces in the journal are not anomalous in the way they thought, because they're only anomalous when other people are involved. They don't do anything in containment. They force people that view them to question fundamental truths about their lives, which is what happened at Site 35. A team of Foundation researchers had been studying the journal, attempting to make sense of its illogical nature, but they started to change, becoming more detached. They stopped interacting with others, started asking strange questions, raving about different ideologies, positions, and politics, while some grew violent. The ones who had grown violent were those with a history of strong positions on various issues, such as political movements or workplace issues, while the others had no such history. The journal, and by extension Hanzarp, was exacerbating their zealotry or their apathy, and the site started to change as well. People working at the site started to see things that weren't there, and impossible changes in geometry. The psychologists who had interviewed the affected researchers also began to change, as the phenomena spread like a virus. The spread is becoming increasingly rampant, both outside of Foundation custody across Europe and inside of various Foundation facilities. The only people that weren't affected by this were those who were trained to use formula and theory to discern truth, but there simply aren't enough of those individuals to stop the spread. One of the doctors insists on staying at Site 35 to continue researching Hanzarp, especially due to some recent disappearances of some Broken God members. It's revealed that he is affected by Hanzarp and is slowly succumbing, but hopes to do as much as possible before then. The Broken God members are clearly the ones building certain machines for Hanzarp, due to having their own reasons for being part of the movement. If you break down what it means to be cool, or what it means to be broken, you're left with everything and nothing being both broken and cool. The doctor had been studying the journal for the past month, trying to make sense of it, but it's ultimately damned him. Additionally, he had mentioned a nonsensical phrase during the conversation, which has likely infected one of the other doctors that had been on the call. The next document is simply an image that was found on the Foundation's database in 1996, although they have no idea how it got on there. The image consists of essentially gibberish, and is apparently titled, "The Pale, Transparent Center Exudes the Dark." The 7th article is not a document, but rather a comprehension survey to determine how well we understand SCP-4485 and our ability to deduce between the logical and illogical. Scoring anything less than 100% will result in immediate removal and containment. The questions consist of things such as what object is directly to our left, asking us specifics about odd images, asking us if we know where we are, and asking how we feel right now. Truth be told, the answers we supply for these questions don't really matter, as long as we complete it. When we do, we're given a massive list of Foundation personnel that are currently in containment due to failing their comprehension exams. We then see a strange message telling us that ever since the Ethics Council was dissolved, the Foundation has been everything we want it to be. Rocks in a blender. Eventually, everything falls apart. The message says that the next part is really not at all important, but please pay attention. It's clear that one of the doctors supervising our orientation is quite affected by Hanzarp, which doesn't bode well. We continue on through to the next document, which consists of some scanned pages from the journal itself. As expected, the pages contain text in various forms, as well as some images and graphics, all of which is deliberately nonsensical. Obviously, the Foundation was never going to make sense of this journal. After checking one of the pages, an error message pops up, informing us that authorization has been approved, along with the word Hanzarp and the Chinese symbol for fish. We're then sent to another SCP document for SCP-4485, this one listed as a Level 6 Cosmic Top Secret Anomaly, meant to be viewed by members of the O5 Council only. The containment procedures are extensive, with the journal, along with all other Hanzarp anomalies and individuals affected by said anomalies, kept in a supracultural dissociation engine at Deep Well 9, located beneath the former Site-35. All European Foundation sites that have been affected by 4485 are closed indefinitely, and they believe that 92% of active Foundation personnel in Europe are at risk of being affected. The orientation system has been implemented to weed out personnel who lack sufficient mental capabilities to avoid being affected by 4485. It's serious enough that if someone fails the orientation, the Foundation locks them away in the deep well, just in case they had already been affected. The Ethics Committee was also dissolved, as they were believed to be both unnecessary and actively detrimental to the containment and elimination of Hanzarp, and also possibly affected themselves. According to the text, the Scranton Jates Supracultural Dissociation Engine houses artifacts and entities that violate the innate conventions and structures of the human cultural egoplex, as well as adversely impact the established conventional reality. It consists of 3 separate subsystems, the first of which is an outer shell composed of titanium alloy plates over a layer of ballistic nanofibers, strong enough to withstand nuclear blasts. The second and largest of the subsystems are the containment units themselves, currently 11 stacked rings of concrete within the deep well shaft, with room for 15 more sections if necessary. Each ring is capable of holding up to 200 individuals in cryogenic stasis, along with containment lockers for various objects related to 4485. Both the cryogenic modules and the lockers are continually supplied with cycled liquid nitrogen. The third subsystem is the Dissociation Engine Core, which used to be classified as an SCP itself. It functions by dissociating cognition from psychological response, and can apparently easily kill anyone that enters the engine core while it's active through immediate brain death. It also functions as a time sink, with 46 days passing inside of the structure for every 1 day outside. Despite all of this, though, the Foundation considers 4485 outside of their ability to control at this point, and it's serious enough that they allow Foundation personnel to take any and all actions in order to assist in containment, with no approval required. We get to learn a bit more about the journal here as well. People that are exposed to it are affected in one of two ways. Those who have had strongly held political or cultural opinions in their recent past will strongly reject the nonsense contained in the journal, but will become increasingly vocal about their positions, soon becoming unable to speak about anything else. They will also become violent towards anyone who questions their positions. They will also change physically, as hardened crystalline structures composed primarily of calcium form over much of their entire bodies. They will still be capable of moving through levitation, but how this is done is unknown. By this point, they will be invariably hostile and will continue to spread the infection. Those who have not had recently strong-held opinions will instead grow far more apathetic and erratic, asking strange, nonsensical questions and making odd comments. They will also spread the infection with anyone they interact with, and will physically change to become less distinct in appearance and more incorporeal. An accumulation of these instances in one location will cause a breakdown in the logical superconstruction of the area, which sounds pretty bad. Finally, we're given a progress report written by the head researcher on 4485. They start with a memo that had been sent out across the Foundation, informing personnel that 4485 and Hanzarp are the most secure they've ever been, with an estimated 99.6% of affected individuals in Foundation custody. They go on to explain a bit of what they know about 4485. They don't believe that the journal itself is anomalous, nor do they think Jean Arp, who wrote the journal, was anomalous. Instead, the anomaly exists within the human interaction with the source, with 4485 acting like a key that perfectly fits a lock inside of the human psyche. Once unlocked, the mind begins to change itself and the world around it. This leads to one of the two different reactions, with the purpose of the violent ones being to create more of the non-violent ones. The non-violent ones are those we would consider to be Hanzarp, a meta-constructure of disorganized thought designed to annihilate reason. It seems that being exposed to the violent ones causes a much higher conversion rate of the other type, which are the real danger. Addressing the O5 Council directly, the doctor says that the SCP Foundation was directly targeted by Hanzarp, because they knew that the Foundation would become involved and have to clean up all of their anomalous art pieces. So far, they have closed over 300 Foundation sites across Europe, necessitating the transportation of hundreds of anomalies to other facilities, massively costing them in resources and personnel. In other words, the Foundation has basically lost control of Europe. Additionally, they have really not contained Hanzarp at all. The people in stasis in the Deep Well were the ones at locked down Foundation sites that they could easily retrieve, but they missed many security personnel and janitorial staff, people on leave, or doctors that mysteriously disappeared while traveling to another site. They believe that there could be hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals now part of Hanzarp, and they're finding more Hanzarp anomalies every day, even outside of Europe. The worst part is the sheer danger of the non-violent entities. A group of 12 of them in a village can destroy reason in the area for months, while more and more are adding to the number and creating larger bubbles. The Foundation itself has 1,000 of them in a structure underground in stasis, held together by a machine that hopefully won't fail at any point. The dissociation engine is essentially a bomb of disorganized thought, and it's being targeted by a group that doesn't care whether logic says it can or cannot go off. The doctor attaches a picture that was found among the ruins of a Foundation site that they had to burn to the ground. The image consists of a sluice gate in service to the Deep Well, and was clearly taken by a member of Hanzarp. The doctor warns the council that they are among us, and they must act swiftly. So, what is Hanzarp? It's nothing. Or rather, it's a superintelligence with the singular purpose of reducing all logic and reason to nothing. The reason for this was stated much earlier, when they discussed that some members of Are We Cool Yet were becoming disillusioned with their failed efforts to become cool. The idea of what is and what isn't cool is pretty tricky to define, especially by Are We Cool Yet standards, and it could be said that regardless of what they do, none of them will ever be cool. Members of Hanzarp had a different thought though, in which if they break down everything connected to logic and reason, there are no longer any rules. If there are no rules, including rules about what is cool or not, then everything could be considered cool, including themselves. Members of the Church of the Broken God had a similar idea, in which if there are no rules for what is considered broken, then everything and nothing could be broken or not. Obviously, the effect spread out to far surpass these goals, and it's hard to say how much thought members of Hanzarp really have in the matter. Regardless, their plan seems to be working, as even the Foundation is practically powerless to stop them. They have some anomalous device to help contain some individuals, but it's a laughable containment scheme when considering the scope of the spread. Doubly so when considering that many members of the Foundation are secretly affected, including the O5 Council itself. The Council had started to become more zealous in their beliefs of how to contain Hanzarp, including locking away anyone that failed the orientation. And when the Ethics Committee objected to this, they dissolved the committee and locked them away as well. SCP-4485 is yet another world-ending threat, but it's a rather unique one, breaking down logic and reason rather than opting for simple destruction. It would seem that the world is in pretty rough shape in this timeline, but you never know, as the Foundation has pulled out of some pretty bad situations before. It's certainly possible, though, that in this timeline, the Broken God will finally be unbroken, and maybe he'll be cool too. The Chicago Spirit. Organized crime is a dark yet fascinating aspect of human history, spread across the globe for hundreds of years, from pirates in the Caribbean to the triads of Hong Kong. If there are laws, there are going to be people who break them, and if there is profit to be found in breaking those laws, they'll find it. The city of Chicago has a very interesting history with organized crime, especially during the Prohibition era in the 1920s and 30s, in which alcoholic beverages were banned nationwide. It's this location and mostly this period we'll be looking at today, in which a group of organized criminals in Chicago utilize anomalies in their pursuit of power and wealth. The leader of the group, known as the Chicago Spirit, was a man named Richard David Chappell, a reality bender, who immigrated to Chicago with his parents when he was 2 in 1873. The first recorded incident showing his anomalous capabilities was when he was 11, when a witness reported seeing Chappell somehow exsanguinating a rival newspaper boy. The boy's body was recovered in the Chicago River the next day, but police didn't pursue the case, and Chappell would later claim the death to be an accident. The Chicago Spirit itself started as a bar in 1893, but made little revenue after 2 years of business, so Chappell had the idea to start a side business on the second floor, selling unnatural novelties. Many of these novelties would be created by Chappell himself, and it's believed that the Chicago Spirit would sell over 600 anomalies during the subsequent years. This venture turned out to be quite a bit more successful than the bar, and it attracted a number of wealthy collectors and members of Chicago's elite. Chappell continued to keep this side of his business as much of a secret as possible, and never used his own anomalous capabilities around others. In time, the Chicago Spirit became a more openly criminal endeavor, expanding into extortion, robbery, and attacks on rival business owners. By 1899, Chappell employed over 400 people, and locals began to refer to his organization as the Chicago Spirit, naming it after the group's headquarters. Most of the people in the organization were, of course, common criminals, But the leaders of the Chicago Spirit were all anomalous themselves, much like Chapel. According to local tradition, Chapel would routinely walk the streets of Chicago in search of people with anomalous capabilities. Over the next year, the organization would continue to grow and make a name for itself among Chicago's criminal underworld, utilizing anomalous objects as part of their operations. The Foundation existed during this time period, but lacked the full resources to properly contain the group. Other criminal groups within Chicago mostly kept their distance from the Chicago Spirit, notably the leader of the Chicago Outfit, Al Capone, who wanted nothing to do with them after witnessing a failed raid against the group. The Chicago Spirit continued to grow throughout the 1920s, controlling a number of speakeasies throughout the country during the Prohibition era. Records indicate that from 1921 to 1933, the Chicago Spirit was the largest anomalous crime syndicate in the Western Hemisphere. Things came to a sudden end in 1933, however, when the Foundation had learned that Chapel's reality-bending powers had weakened, and they launched a raid on his home. Sure enough, the raid was successful, and Chapel was placed into containment along with 155 anomalies pulled from his personal collection. The Chicago Spirit all but crumbled apart after the capture of their leader, with only a certain few remaining loyal to the group until the anomalies they possessed were picked up by Marshall Carter and Dark in 1938. In 2008, a collection of private journals were recovered by the Foundation, allegedly written by Chapel. The journals frequently mention a Mr. Knight, who apparently was the actual anomalous individual that made the Chicago Spirit possible, with Chapel possessing no anomalous properties himself. According to Chapel, this Mr. Knight individual had abruptly quit the organization in 1933, changed his name, and fled the country, allowing the capture of Chapel. No other documents exist supporting the existence of this Mr. Knight, but Chapel continued to insist that he was his partner. Let's continue on and take a look at some of the anomalies that the Chicago Spirit have been involved with, now contained by the Foundation. First, we have SCP-2680, which contains 3 different versions of the SCP documentation. I'll have to warn you, though, that this one is pretty disgusting. The first describes it as an anomalous viral disease resembling smallpox, with symptoms including the formation of irregular pustules, inflamed spots, lassitude, and delirium. No known cure for this disease exists, and the pustules that form are quite different than normal. They form on both a subject's extremities and outer bodies, but also in internal cavities, such as livers and intestines. Additionally, the pustules are filled with a greenish mixture consisting of pus and alcohol. These pustules continually swell with fluid until they burst, thus spraying the immediate area around the victim with fluid, which is the primary way by which this disease spreads. Infected patients also tend to chew on their own pustules to cause them to burst, consuming some of the liquid in the process, which they describe as a soothing way to cope with the disease. The fatality rate of SCP-2680 infection is greater than 90%, with death typically occurring after 30 to 50 days, compared to the 10 to 16 days of smallpox victims. Death is caused by the rapid and immediate bursting of all pustules both inside and outside the body, causing the body to explosively rupture. A report from the MTF captain when they first encountered the disease explains that the team was well suited to hearing rumors about awful diseases that turned men into ghouls or dissolved them, so they took the reports with a grain of salt. The reports brought them to a small farming village in Missouri, where they were told that the town doctor was dead from the disease, along with most of the rest of the townfolk. One girl was in quarantine in the clinic, but the rest of her family had fled. The team entered the remains of the clinic, which had largely been burned down, and found a locked trapdoor to the cellar. Breaking the lock, they found the basement filled with scorched human bones, rows of beds blown to smithereens with empty husks of bodies left in the ruins, looking like they were popped balloons. The girl that was still alive was in the far corner of the room, festering in her own filth, riddled with pustules that she was gnawing on. The team tried to communicate with her, but she simply continued chewing on herself, and the team was very concerned that her family that fled was also infected somewhere. The girl died 3 hours later, swelling up before exploding as the team ran. Returning to the basement, they found it covered in blood, pus, and alcohol. They bagged the remains of the body, burned down the rest of the clinic, and left. 2 weeks later, one of the team became infected, despite their precautions, and after 2 weeks in quarantine, he exploded as well. At the time, in 1891, it was estimated that as many as 30% of smallpox victims were actually infected with SCP-2680, and it was recommended that mandated euthanization be the best method for containment. By 1896, however, they had found a cure for 99% of cases, combining alcohol with the secretions of some sort of redacted creature. That was all pretty horrific and disgusting, but this version of the document was marked as erroneous in 1919, leading to the creation of a second version of the document. They learned that the anomaly isn't the disease itself, but a form of alcohol that causes the disease when imbibed. The pustules created by the disease contain more of this anomalous alcohol, which is how it can easily spread. In most other ways, the disease is quite similar to smallpox, although it is not a fatal disease on its own. Victims of the disease develop a chronic urge to pick at and eat their own skin, storing the skin inside of their digestive tract for around 3 to 6 weeks. At this point, the victim will defecate a mass of dead skin in the shape and texture of a glass bottle. They will then proceed to fill this skin bottle with the liquids contained in the pustules, at which point the victim will seem to recover from the disease. The victims will be under the delusion that this practice will cure them of the disease, but symptoms return after 24 hours. They also believe that the liquid from the pustules can cure the illness, and seek to spread it to as many people as possible. In 1918, an infected employee at a distillery in Minnesota contaminated the entire plant with 2680, spreading the disease to the neighboring towns. 453 people had to be euthanized, and much of the region was incinerated by the Foundation to contain the situation. The Foundation actually began working with the Chicago Spirit to help contain things, as I mentioned that a cure had been found which involved alcohol mixed with some sort of secretions. Prohibition was well underway in the US, but they needed to spread this alcohol concoction as much as possible, which is where the Spirit come in. An individual named Roland McDell gave a testimony in 1926 discussing the operation. Actually handing out the alcohol was the easy part, as the organization had the illegal selling of alcohol completely handled in the US, and simply mixing in the component handed out by the Foundation wasn't much trouble. The trouble was from the fact that word went around about the Chicago Spirit working with the authorities, with the Foundation basically seeming like a government agency. It took a long time to even convince the members of the Chicago Spirit to go along with it, let alone the people at all the speakeasies. For a while, they simply brought in alcohol from Canada and laced it with the component from the Foundation, rather than brewing the concoction from scratch. It seems that around this time, the spread of SCP-2680 was truly rampant among those that drank alcohol illegally, and so it didn't take long for people to figure out that only those drinking a certain brand from the Chicago Spirit were not getting infected. That's when the competition became interested, none of which were as big as the Chicago Spirit, but each could be a threat. A number of these competitors involved anomalous individuals themselves, and when the Chicago Spirit teamed up with the Foundation, they really became aggressive. According to Roland, however, magic don't mean squat when you're staring down the barrel of a Thompson. A raid by a group Roland refers to as the Leadheads, possibly connected to the Church of the Broken God, left 12 of the Chicago Spirit members dead. In retaliation, they launched a counter-raid led by Chappell himself, which involved dumping a barrel of acid over their leader's body, melting him completely. They turned his remains into trophies for their bars in order to send a message. Roland also says this as a message to the Foundation, that if they try and pull something on the Chicago Spirit will pull right back. Things seemed rather under control then, with the Foundation handling the anomalous ingredient that prevented the virus from spreading, and the Chicago Spirit handling the alcohol transactions. This lasted until 1933, it seems, with both the end of the Chicago Spirit and the end of Prohibition in the US. The third and current version of the SCP-2680 document describes the anomaly as an unidentified species of macrovirus that resembles bottles of various types of alcoholic beverages, most commonly Bud Light and Coors Light beer. The bottles and bottle cap are composed of silica and anomalous forms of carotene, while the liquid inside mimics the physical properties of alcohol, but is composed of various proteins and stem cells. The liquid causes intoxicating effects similar to alcohol, but also causes the imbiber's esophageal tract to widen and converts excess esophageal tissue into specialized glands that produce the 2680 fluid. Infected individuals also pick at and eat their skin, gradually consuming the skin around their digits, limbs, and torso. After 6 weeks, they will regurgitate consumed tissue in the form of a bottle, and fill it with regurgitated 2680 fluid. Once they have produced 6 filled bottles, they will start the process again. They will also experience anterograde amnesia, believing the bottles to be store-bought alcohol. A Protestant community was discovered to be completely infected with 2680, with young children producing bottles in the form of Coca-Cola and Fanta brand bottles of soda. It would seem that the virus is continuing to evolve and learn how best to spread, so even though the Chicago Spirit did some good work with the Foundation to help curb the spread in the 20s and 30s, they didn't eradicate it. So yeah, that was all pretty disgusting, and it's not like the Chicago Spirit were helping out due to any sort of altruism, but more due to not wanting to lose valuable customers. Let's look at some SCPs that the Spirit actually used themselves for their criminal activities. SCP-3138 is a phenomenon in which human corpses are somehow inserted into printed works of published fiction. The nature of the work can vary, from poems to novels, but the work must consist of a narrative capable of describing the presence of the corpses. The corpses can be recovered by destroying the work or removing the text describing the presence of the corpse, at which point the corpse will suddenly reappear. The corpses themselves are non-anomalous, but show signs of decay similar to that of extended submersion in an acidic environment. A paperback copy of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens includes a section in which 2 characters pass through a room in which 3 smartly dressed corpses are hung up on the bare walls, their attire dark and unusual. One of the characters shushes the other and urges them forward, and the narrative moves on. After recovering the 3 corpses, only one was identified, an accountant with known ties to a mob boss active in Chicago during the 1920s. A copy of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald includes only a single line, mentioning 7 additional corpses next to one already included in the novel. Only 6 of the corpses were able to be recovered, with 4 of them identified as known associates of Al Capone. A 1912 edition of Collected Poems by Edgar Allan Poe includes 2 changed lines that mention the corpse of someone named Beverly Queen. The recovered corpse couldn't be identified, but a missing persons report had been filed in 1932 for a 17-year-old girl named Beverly Queen, who had been living with Richard Chappell. Apparently, the Chicago Spirit found a pretty clever way of hiding bodies that didn't involve dumping them into the river. The Foundation still has no idea how they managed to put the corpses into the texts in the first place. Although the sale of alcohol was prohibited in the US from 1920 to 1933, there were plenty of places where you could illegally get a drink, generally referred to as speakeasies. Although they generally tried to keep things quiet, they were often raided by police, but due to their profitability, they continued to reopen across the country. It's estimated that there were somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 speakeasies operating in New York City alone by 1925. A number of them ran by organized criminals. The Chicago Spirit, of course, controlled a large number of typical speakeasies in the Chicago area, but when Chappell wanted to move into the New York market, he decided to keep things extra quiet, with SCP-3855. 3855 is a two-story building located in Manhattan that operated as a Chicago Spirit speakeasy from 1921 to 1930, known as the Secret Spirit. Chappell had somehow given the establishment anti-memetic properties, meaning that the name, location, and purpose of the building could not be recalled normally. If visited, the memories of their time there would simply leak out of a person's head. There was a trigger phrase, however, that if heard or read would nullify the anti-memetic properties. This phrase was, "I heard about Chappell's Manhattan Point." This anomalous secrecy worked for many years, with the Chicago Spirit being very careful about who to provide the trigger phrase to. The managers of the bar wished to expand the concept to other speakeasies in Manhattan, but Chappell vetoed the idea, saying that he got this far in life by being careful. If they fill New York with speakeasies that nobody can remember going to, people are going to start noticing. In 1930, one of the co-owners of the bar was arrested by the NYPD on an unrelated charge, and was offered a reduced sentence by the police after learning about his Chicago Spirit affiliation. He accepted the deal, spilling the beans about the Secret Spirit, leading to the establishment being raided and shut down. The co-owner was relocated to Maine as part of a protective custody program, where he lived for 2 years before suddenly disappearing one day while walking home from work. His hat and jacket were left behind on the ground, with a note in the jacket pocket reading, "Nice try. You can't hide, snitch." Selling illegal alcohol is all well and good, but sometimes a group as large and powerful as the Chicago Spirit needs to pull off a big score, and for that, you pull out some heavy hitters. SCP-638 is the designation for a crew of 5 individuals that performed a heist in 1914 while working for the Chicago Spirit, under the direct leadership of Richard Chappell. Each of these 6 individuals were anomalous, with Chappell of course being a powerful reality bender. Louis Bagel Bernstein was a pyromancer. Mads Moody possessed anomalous strength. Giuseppe Permonto Fiori was anomalously persuasive, and the Chinese twins Ah Noom and Ah Tom were both thaumaturges. The heist they pulled off in 1914 was the theft of 2,000 short tons of gold bullion contained in the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. The Chicago police, with assistance from embedded Foundation agents, managed to apprehend the 5 criminals, but Chappell and the gold were gone. Embedded Foundation agent Chad Pick interviewed the 5 individuals to find out where Chappell and the gold had gone. Bagel Bernstein starts out pretty casual during the interview, although he says that he's just as scared of Chappell as everyone else, despite working with him. He also isn't that worried because he didn't kill anyone during the heist, so he'll avoid capital punishment, and he can go and pick up the gold after he gets out of jail. Pick asks him why he thinks that none of the other guys have the same idea, and that one of them might get out of jail a little earlier to get the gold first. This makes Bagel sweat a bit, and he tells Pick that he burned through the vault door, but the twins were responsible for using magic to move the gold out of the bank, so they know where it is. He figures that Chappell must be planning something, even though it seems like it all went wrong. Next, Pick talks to Moody, who says that Bagel and Chappell planned everything out. He was just the muscle. He does reveal that Giuseppe helped get them into the bank in the first place, because he knew a strega, a witch employed by the mafia. He and Chappell made a deal with her, although Moody doesn't know any of the details, and they ended up with some small bottles of liquid supplied by the witch. Apparently, if they drank this liquid, everyone else would think they were bank guards, until they did something to make them think otherwise. Moody doesn't really know much else, although he doesn't trust Bagel or Giuseppe, He believes that Chapel was never actually in the bank with them in person, probably using some sort of anomalous ability to just appear that way. After they burned through the vault, he disappeared into thin air, and they were soon after surrounded by cops. Speaking with Giuseppe, Pick asks him about the deal they made with the Strega. He doesn't know what Chapel offered her, or if he just intimidated her, but she did require some things from the people they wanted to impersonate, including hair and blood. Giuseppe doesn't know where the twins moved the gold, but he does know a little about magic, and knows that they don't possess the power to move that much gold outside of the city, or even that far from the reserve. He believes that Chapel is working with the twins to make off with the gold, leaving the rest of the group stranded in jail. Pick moves on to speaking with the twins, only one of which can talk. Pick demands that they tell him where the gold is, and Tom suggests that perhaps Pick has some sort of personal stake in finding it. They want to make a deal, since they'll never find the gold without the twins' help. Pick mentions that one of the twins' tongues has been cut out, and Tom asks how he knew that, to which Pick says that Bagel told him. Tom then says that the group was given 7 bottles from the Strega, not 6, and asks the agent to parlay. Pick orders the stenographer out of the interrogation room, and the rest of the interview is not transcribed. The next day, Agent Pick failed to clock in, and his apartment was investigated, finding the door blown off of its hinges and the interior in shambles. Detective Pick's corpse was discovered stuffed into a closet, and in an advanced state of decomposition, dead for at least a week. Tufts of hair were missing from his scalp, and he appeared to have died from blood loss. Further investigation found the bodies of the Chinese twins stuffed into a large garbage receptacle in an alley behind the building, both dead from gunshot wounds to the head. What happened here was that in addition to the 6 bottles they were given from the Strega to allow the 6 of them to masquerade as bank guards, a 7th vial was given to Chapel to allow him to secretly masquerade as Agent Pick. After they entered the vault together, Chapel disappeared and reappeared as Agent Pick, unbeknownst to the group. He then conducted interviews with them in disguise, partially to determine if any of them would snitch on him, but mostly to determine where the twins hid the gold. After the twins realized who Pick was, they made a deal with Chapel off the record, but once Chapel had the gold, he murdered both of the twins. The Chicago Spirit is just another interesting and unusual aspect of the SCP universe, taking something that is normally a mundane aspect of human history and making it extraordinary. Gangsters during the Prohibition era are fascinating enough to warrant plenty of fictional and non-fictional works, but adding in that secret spice of SCP to the mix just makes things even more exciting. The Chicago Spirit, like every other group of interest in the SCP universe, is a work in progress, with more and more entries being added about them as time goes on. They are technically a defunct group nowadays, although there's talk of a resurging group known as the Chicago Spectre that's following in their footsteps. For now, though, I hope this has been an interesting look at one way that normal modern history can be made quite paranormal.
Okay, it's kind of late for me now, so I should probably end this stream right about here, but yeah, I feel like I made significant progress here. If you can already tell, I don't know if you could, but doing those 8-bit stages was kind of boring, and it was kind of hard, to be honest, especially that Iceman tree. Like, why is there a palm tree in the Arctic? Anyway, next stream I'm probably just going to continue the same process just because I'm actually really enjoying this, but I think I'll try and focus more on the 16-bit games, like the SNES games, because, well, as you can see, I mean, it's just that much more detailed, and it just looks so much, I don't know, it just looks better in my opinion. But yeah, I'm gonna end it here. I'll continue all of this tomorrow perhaps. Let's see what happens depending on my schedule. But yeah, I don't know what else to say, but oh, and I apologize for this SCP stuff. It was a little bit disturbing and kind of weird, but to be honest, like that's just the nature of the SCP universe, I guess. Some of them are really good though, so don't let it turn you off if it was all about like that pus and all that weird crap. But yeah, I'm probably just gonna keep doing this until I finish up these renders. But yeah, I don't know what else to say. I'm tired and I'm just gonna go to sleep now. So yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking by. You know, dropping in and just seeing what I'm up to. But I really appreciate it. So I'll catch you next time.